Have you ever heard of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire?
Well, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 in New York City has been a major turning point for women's rights, safety in workplaces, immigrant rights, and guided unions. But first, we need to explain what happened on and before March 25, 1911.
Before we talk about the terrible fire itself, we need to mention the already intense working conditions of the women working in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. Each day, the women worked for 12.5 hours, only getting paid $6 each week, along with being locked in the musty factory by the manager. The women working there couldn't go to the bathroom, and the room they were in was filled with highly flammable materials. The rooms were packed to the brim with the most amount of machines and the smallest space for the workers to work in. The type of workers that were being hired by the factory were teenage and young woman immigrants working to support their families.
There were a few unions starting to sprout in the early 1900s. However, most of them were dismantled by the corporate organizations.
At exactly 4:40 p.m. on March 25, 1911, on the 8th floor of the Ash Building in Lower Manhattan, a fire started from a match or cigarette that had been discarded, or a rag bin on the floor. And with the cotton and paper everywhere, that was what fueled the fire and made it stronger than it first was, according to Britannica School. The fire apparently lasted 18 minutes and 129 women died, and many were injured in the hospitals for weeks. When the fire happened, extensive news articles were made, one showing an illustration of a skeleton with a building inspector uniform on, along with many other photos depicting how terrible the conditions were. The rag bin with cotton and paper and the discarded match or cigarette weren't the only reason for the fire. The building itself was already extremely unsafe because, along with the women not being paid enough and working for way too long, there were no sprinklers, the factory was placed out of reach of fire ladders, and there was only one room for emergency exits. The elevator was broken, so when the fire happened and the women were locked in the room, they had no choice but to try to get down to the elevator. At that point, they were all collapsed on top of each other, trying to get down safely, and some of them might as well have died from suffocating in that elevator. One particular hero, though, stood out. 21-year-old Fanny Lansner tried to get as many women on the elevator as possible before jumping to her death out the factory window, so as many other women who could not fit did.
The employer had all of the judgment and decision-making power of how the workplace was set up and whether women could take breaks or whether they could leave. And so that ultimately backfired, no pun intended. It was an alarm that raised up the country's attention and visibility, because when women and children die, it gets people's attention.
You may be wondering, what happened to the terrible men who locked the women in the factory during the fire?
This brings us to our next topic, Isaac Harris and Max Blanc. In 1900, they started the Shirtwaist Factory Company in Manhattan, New York. Before the fire, Harris and Blanc had already had a strange history of factory fires in the years leading up. The consequences of their actions were that they had to pay $75 to each victim's family, according to the 23 lawsuits filed against them. However, they were actually making money off of these deaths because their corporation said that they would get $250 each time there was a death.
This is another example of unfair women's rights. in the 1900s. The Triangle Fire also had a big impact on music, as 2 songs were created, My Little Triangle Fire by Rasputina and Ballad of the Triangle Fire by Ruth Rubin. My Little Triangle Fire used sad, figurative language to describe a woman dying in the staircase of the factory. And the other song described the entire fire from start to finish in detail.
Darkness filled the sky. Then on that fateful day, dear God.
The Triangle Fire caused many women and other people to revolt against the unsafe conditions with different labor movements because, as Liz Shuler said, death equals attention. The Factory Investigating Commission was created that year, which investigated different factories across the country in an attempt to lessen the horrible working conditions. Many protests were organized against Max Planck and Isaac Harris, and the fire still has affected us today. There are still many places in the world where there are unfair rules at factories, and that means there are still protests going on about that.
We've been fighting for a long time for safety protections for workers, and we're still fighting. But I think, we're continuing to fight for, say, heat protections, which is a great example, knowing we're enduring climate change.
Although there was a law that was passed that October regarding fire prevention, no laws were passed then that really helped the women's rights movement, which leads us to the next discussion, Frances Perkins and the labor movement.
Frances Perkins was born 1882 in Boston, Massachusetts, and she died 1965. In her lifetime, she became one of the most important women for our nation. She was the first female U.S. Secretary of Labor during the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt. She made many laws and enforcements in our government, such as fair wages, better working conditions, a limit on employment of children under 16. She also happened to be standing outside the building during the fire. If not for this, she might not have gone down the path that she did, and our country wouldn't have as many wonderful laws in place. The AFLCIO, a national trade union center, has a room in their building for remembering and honoring Frances Perkins. Someone who follows in her footsteps is Elizabeth Shuler, the first female president of the AFL-CIO. Her job is to fight for every working American. We had a wonderful opportunity to interview Shuler about the Triangle Fire.
The potential you have, and the talent you have, and, growing into hopefully the workers of the future, right? And you're going to be navigating a whole different kind of workplace. And so I think that's what we're thinking about here in the union movement is, as the work is changing, as the workforce is changing, how can unions be there to help workers navigate through this kind of change?
In summary, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire of 1911 had a very big impact on women's child labor, worker safety, immigrant fire safety, and the workers' rights movement today. No amount of trials, lawsuits, or protests will make up for the terror of that afternoon, but we can keep fighting for the rights of all workers, no matter their background, age, sex, or status. We hope you learned about the Triangle Fire events and what has come out of it. And a special huge thanks to President Liz Shuler of the AFL-CIO.